Kara Shalom, welcome to our watercolor journey. Today we're going to focus a bit more on brushes and specific techniques in this landscape. The materials used are listed in the description below. On the palette we have nickel Azo Yellow, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, phthalo blue green shade and Payne's grey blue. All the paints are by Ochre and the alternatives are listed in yellow. The Canson paper is taped to the board and the board is at an angle of 45 degrees. Having the paper at an angle will help with the natural flow of the paint. If you want more control over your paint, you can place the board flat on the table. Heinrich usually squeezes the tubed paints into a palette to allow them to dry out and to make them easier to use. In this way, paint is not wasted. To reactivate the hardened paints, he sprays the little blocks with some water and then he uses an old synthetic brush to mix the paints in the mixing palette. He prefers using an old brush to do this because the rubbing action of the brush on the hardened palette may damage his good brushes. Once the paint has been reactivated, you can use any brush. He uses the silver number 14 mop to wet the entire paper. This mop is made of goat hair and is ideal for wetting the background because it holds a lot of water and spreads it very evenly. Here's a tip. Allow the mop to soak in water for a few seconds before you use it. That will help with water retention. He starts with a watery mix of yellow ochre in the sky and he uses the silver black velvet number 12 round, which is a squirrel synthetic blend. It keeps a beautiful sharp point and holds quite a lot of water. Then he moves to the phthalo blue green shade for the top of the sky. Core paints generally spread like wildfire, so keep an eye on the flow of your paint. The blue flows gently into the yellow ochre, but because he doesn't fiddle with it, the blend does not turn green. He uses a sweeping motion with the belly of the brush to add some Payne's grey to the phthalo blue to darken it a bit. The few darker clouds depict a bit of an overcast sky. When you paint the sky, use your darker, stronger pigments at the top and the lighter, more watery pigments at the bottom to create distance. Lightly spread the paint up to the horizon line. The horizon line is about 2/3 down the paper. It's never in the middle because that makes your painting look like it's split in two. Add the base layer of the foreground with watery yellow ochre. This is done to bring a bit of warmth into the foreground. Usually the cooler colors will push the objects to the back and warmer colors will bring them more to the front. Heinrich mixes some nickel Azo Yellow into the blue mix to create a soft green, which he dabs into the wet middle ground with the tip of the brush. Because you are working wet on wet, the green spreads nicely to form natural tree shapes. This pigment is a tad stronger than the previous pigments so that they don't spread too much and so that you don't get blooms and cauliflowers. Add Payne's grey to darken the green for the shadows. Use the same colors to paint the other background trees and add a bit of yellow ochre to bring some variation. This is important to create interest and so your trees don't have a flat, dead color. This also helps to establish your values of light, middle and dark. The variation of the cooler dark colors and the warmer light colors give dimension to the trees. This is also done wet on wet, so there won't be any hard edges and it will fade into the background once dry. The soft fused colors help to give suggestions of shapes. The further back your objects are, the less detail you need to add. He wants brighter greens in the immediate foreground, so he doesn't clean the brush and just keeps adding the mixes from his palette to create the base layer for the grasses. Allow the paint to mix on the paper and add the blue to bring variation. Play the warmer and cooler colors off against each other to create interest. Use the tip of the brush and some burnt sienna to draw in some loose grasses. The paper is still very wet, so the paints blend naturally. This is the reason why the paper is soaked in the beginning, to allow you to create all these effects in one go. If the paper dries too quickly, you won't have the same results. You can use a spray bottle to wet the paper slightly if it becomes too dry, but spray from a distance so you don't disturb the existing pigment too much, which will destroy your initial look and might create unwanted blooms. Let the painting dry. Allow the paint to settle a bit before you use a hairdryer on it. The ideal is to let it dry naturally. Once the painting is dry, he will use a Chinese calligraphy brush. According to the supplier, it's a rabbit hair brush, but one cannot really be sure with these no-name brushes. The belly is almost cone-shaped, so Heinrich felt that it wasn't the ideal brush to work with, but he wanted to give it a try. He used the brush to paint the roof of the little house, and he struggled a bit to get the shape right. You will notice that this part of the painting is very light. This allows him to paint the darker house in the lighter space. He used this space to serve as the wall of the house and only painted in the doors, windows, and shadow lines on the sides. If you're not comfortable painting it in freehand, you can draw a light outline of the house before you start painting. He paints some darker trees next to and behind the little house. This frames the house and makes it stand out a bit more. He uses all the colors on the palette to bring variety in the bushes around the house. Place the darker values at the bottom of the bushes to give some shadow. He works on both sides of the house to make sure there is harmony in the colors of the bushes. He uses a thinner Chinese brush to start the trees. These rat tail calligraphy brushes are phenomenal when it comes to painting thin lines or making foliage. These trees are in the background, so there is a limited amount of detail. He draws the branches very lightly and dabs in some of the greens from his palette for the foliage. He paints the trees wet on dry to create hard edges. The hard edges help to make the trees stand out against the softer background. He wants to establish a clearer horizon line, so he adds some shrubs here to give form and texture to the middle ground. To add some interest to the house, he draws in a fence. These lines are loose and they are not uniform. They are only suggestive of a fence, so don't labor too much with those. Add some bushes to the front of the house to make the terrain more interesting, to give it a real rural feel. The house is the focal point, so you need to draw the attention to that area of the painting. He uses the tip of the brush to draw in some loose grasses. He dabs a few dots onto the tips of the stems to resemble seed pods. Notice the grasses are bent towards the house. This also leads the eye into the painting. Use a variety of greens and browns to paint the grasses. Always remember to use the 3 different values. They will help to build volume in the grassland. Make sure to draw a slight shadow line underneath the grass to ground it. He leaves a slight gap here to open the view up to the house so that the picture plane isn't boxed in. To create the illusion of a footpath, he uses the belly of the brush. He starts with a thin point at the door and then broadens the stroke towards the corner of the paper to create perspective. This line will also lead your eye to the house. Using the belly of the brush gives a broken line effect known as dry brushing. This is a marvelous technique to create texture and interest. Start adding fine lines for texture in the distance. Further away, the lines are thinner, so here he still uses the rat tail calligraphy brush. The strokes will become wider and more prominent as they come closer to the front, so we will switch to the bigger silver black velvet again to paint the foreground. He varies the colors, and the closer he comes to the front, the warmer the colors and color mixes. He mostly uses the belly of the brush, and this gives the terrain definition and texture. The foreground is more sandy, and the closer you get to the house, the greener it becomes. The browns created the look of a small depression on the right, so he paints a lone tree on the edge of the depression. This tree is right in the foreground, so it will be darker and much more detailed. He uses the tip of the rat tail calligraphy brush again to paint the branches. Take your time when you create the tree. Think about what you want it to look like and where you want the branches to be. Add as many branches as you like. Pay attention to the values. Use the light, middle and dark values to give the tree dimension. Use the belly of the brush to add some foliage. This will also be done in the 3 values. He grounds the tree on the edge of the ridge and adds some grasses. He adds the last few finishing touches, building values and adding shadows where needed. Stand away from your painting and evaluate it at a distance. This will give you a better view and it will be easier to see whether you need to add something. This might also stop you from overworking the painting. Let us know in the comments if you found these tips and techniques helpful. Thank you so much for watching. We hope to see you soon. Vaya con Dios.